I love a good mystery. And being an historian is like being a detective. Except there are no femme fatales and you don't usually need a gun. The best mysteries are people. What motivates them? Why do they do what they do? I think that's one reason someone like James K. Polk was so interesting. He's a person surrounded by all sorts of intrigues. Like what was in that locked box delivered to the White House? What had he been secretly buying for years? Why was he so fixated on land and expansion? What did he do on his deathbed that had his mother in a panic? Why is this president largely forgotten today? The last question, that's the one that had me stumped. 2 years I've been trying to answer that question. Trying to understand this man and what he did. No, that's not right. It goes back to when I was around 6.
We know that, but where else are we?
That was when I first went to Washington, D.C. Saw the museums and the monuments and the White House. It was at that age that I saw Ken Burns' The Civil War on PBS. I watched those old VHS copies over and over again, just about wore out the soundtrack. And it was at that age when my parents got me these presidential flashcards. Huh. Made in West Germany. I'm getting old. I got to where I could recite these forwards and backwards. As for Polk, a one-termer, no one special. It wasn't until college, as a history major, that I began to learn anything about him at all. I was struck by how his name seemed to keep coming up, and I think I felt a bit sorry for him. I mean, guys like Lincoln and Nixon have been done to death. There was nothing for Polk, and a documentary seemed so simple. I produce the man, his name gets restored, and I bask in the reflected glow. Oh, if only I knew what I was getting myself into. And after all that, I've only just begun to make sense of it all. And there was so little that made sense. I mean, here was one of the youngest presidents ever elected, who went into office with a clear agenda, and who did it all. The country as we know it was because of him. He acquired the Oregon Territory and the Southwest all the way to California, and he annexed Texas. In 4 years, he took the U.S. from the Great Plains to the Pacific Coast. That seemed like a great resume, right? So why did I have to wait until college to hear about him? He's nowhere in a recent Gallup poll. But then again, George Washington ranked 7th behind someone named No Opinion, so maybe it wasn't the best source. What did the experts have to say? The 1948 Schlesinger poll ranked Polk 10th. The London Times and the Wall Street Journal both placed him 9th. Did they know something the rest of us didn't? Was it a matter of getting the word out? Well, job done. Thanks for coming, everyone. Have a safe drive, and oh, don't forget to buy the special edition DVD. Available at all fine retailers and Walmart. But it never is that simple, is it? In their own poll, Rolling Stone magazine counts him among the worst. A Washington Post column agreed. I only managed to find one poll that ranked him number 1. RateMyMullet.com. So who was right? As I dug into the available material, I began to wonder if either opinion was really accurate. Eugene McCormick wrote the definitive biography of Polk 85 years ago. This one was so old that when it was published, most of the people mentioned in it were still alive. Other crucial sources went out of print a century ago, or they're only available in edited form or on blurry microfilm. So what I had was a bunch of disparate opinions based on a record that was incomplete or out of date. It was no good. There was a good story here if only I could get at it, find an angle. So I went out on a limb, and I wrote a letter to the man himself, Ken Burns. And believe it or not, I got a reply. Well, from his assistant. It contained the transcript of an interview he gave, and 2 lines stood out. Share the process of discovery. Look for new ways to tell a story. That gave me an idea. I trashed my original script. Instead, I was going to see the land that Polk himself was so captivated by, and find some answers for myself. That's where the story begins. It was May 2008. That morning in Carbondale was quiet and drizzly. I was nervous. I remember wishing for a way to put it off another day or a week. Thankfully, I wasn't alone at the start. That's Mark. Hey, say hi to everyone. He's an old friend from my undergrad days. He helped on my very first film, acted, ran camera, and in general kept me from going nuts on a project that went way out of control. But I digress. Now, we were both fans of Hunter Thompson, and I was tempted to rent something flashy for our savage journey into America. But money was tight, so I borrowed the family van instead.
A long goodbye. A long goodbye. And it happens every day.
Please drive to highlighted route.
The gear was loaded up, the hotel booked, the batteries charged. This was it. There was no turning back.
Well, my mom, she's the 10th of 13 kids, right?
On the road, Mark and I chatted a bit,
And,
but I didn't feel like talking much.
She drops
I
out
still
of
couldn't
high
shake
school
those
at
jitters.
16, gets her GED. And, so anyway, she's bumming around with this guy named Dennis Wild.
Continue 175 miles on I-24 East.
Huh. This was going to take a while. Maybe now would be a good time for some background. When James K. Polk was born in 1795, the United States was barely a decade old. It was a fragile cluster of 15 states and some unorganized territory, vying for land with other, greater powers. First, you had New Spain in the west, and New France in the middle, which was also known as Louisiana, until Spain got that too before giving it back to France, who eventually sold it to the US in 1803. Then you had the British in the north, along with the Russians in Alaska, who I couldn't fit on this map, so an arrow will have to do. And then you had these territories, who no one knew who the heck they belonged to. Not to mention all the native peoples who were there first. Polk was born in North Carolina, near Charlotte. But when he was a boy, his father Sam moved the whole family west to Tennessee, settling along the Duck River, where he prospered in land speculation and helped establish the town of Columbia. James made his name in Tennessee, first as a lawyer, then a state politician, then a congressman, and finally governor. He spent most of his life here, so it seemed a good place to start. And after 4 hours of driving, Mark and I arrived in Columbia. It was once a farming community. It still is to some extent, but it's grown up, adapted to the highway that cleaves it neatly in two. The Polk name still lingers, though. But like in countless cities and towns, as they expanded, the old places were torn down, replaced by neat little historic markers that dot the street corners and highway shoulders. Downtown, the old cemetery is still there. A lot of the early townsfolk were buried here. It took 10 minutes of searching, but we eventually found the Polk section of the cemetery, which contains several siblings, as well as his parents, Sam and Jane. James himself isn't buried here. But there was one spot that made Columbia special. Amid restaurants and shops and busy intersections is a simple home, a starter by today's standards. Back when Sam built it, it was one of the best in town. Today it houses the largest collection of James Polk relics. Funny enough, the man himself only lived here occasionally. His ambitions meant he was often on the road or rooming in boarding houses. But still, James K. Polk was here. Ah, here. Was this the one? Was this the desk where he wrote all those letters the year he got the presidential nomination? Ironically, he wasn't really after the White House in 1844. His eyes were on the vice presidency. Besides, 1844 was Martin Van Buren's year. Van Buren had been president before, but a credit crisis hurt his popularity. When voters had to choose between him or his challenger, an elderly general in frail health, they thought the general was a safer bet. The joke was on them, though. The general died after only a month in office, and his replacement was so unpopular, his own party expelled him. Yes, sir, 1844 was going to be Van Buren's big comeback, and he almost had it. He had a majority of the votes going into the Democratic National Convention, but the rules required a 2/3 supermajority. To make matters worse, he wasn't so sure about statehood for Texas, which was the hot-button issue of that campaign season.
What is Texas going to mean? Is it going to be a slave state? Could Texas become 5 slave states? Could Texas be divided up? I mean, what are the implications of an area of land this size coming in?
But the party was largely pro-Texas, and so Van Buren was stalled. The convention soon deadlocked, which was precisely what Polk wanted. He assumed that Van Buren would step aside. Polk's agents would then suggest Silas Wright, who was a Van Buren ally and would pick up his supporters. And with the southern states following Polk's lead, Wright would have enough votes to win the nomination. And because of his role, Polk figured he was a shoo-in for the running mate spot. But he made one mistake. He didn't count on Van Buren's stubbornness, and Wright wouldn't compete while his friend was still in the fight. If Polk's operatives didn't do something, someone else would. And so they went for a Hail Mary. They switched the names. The gamble worked. Polk was pro-Texas, and he was the protege of General Andrew Jackson, military hero and former president, who was to Democrats then as Reagan is to Republicans today. He was so powerful that rumors abounded that he had orchestrated the nomination. Did that sting Polk's pride? Just a little? His whole career he seemed caught in Jackson's shadow, was accused of being a puppet, of riding Old Hickory's coattails. Old Hickory, even the nickname, Polk was called Young Hickory. That's how closely they were associated. He's still in Jackson's shadow today. Polk's a footnote and Jackson's a banknote. In 2008, a brand new biography was published on Polk, the first in years. But who gets featured on The Daily Show?
American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House.
He was the only president who tried to assault his own assassin. To me, that's a threshold question for a book.
Now, as far as I knew, James Polk never so much as punched anyone, so I had my work cut out for me. Heck, even compare their historic sites. First you have Polk's, and now Jackson's. 350 acres of trails, trees, cabins, and gardens, at the center of which sits a palatial neoclassical style mansion, all of which is seen by 250,000 people a year. James had a mansion of his own, where he retired after the White House. And we ventured into downtown Nashville to find it.
Turn left on 9th Avenue North.
A placard marks the spot, but everything else has changed somewhat. All that remains is this iron fountain, which is back at the Polk home, along with some furniture.
Polk has always been overshadowed by Jackson and Lincoln, and he's the man that is somewhere in between the two. That's what people sort of remember about him. He is not one who excites the public attention. He didn't in his day, and he doesn't today.
Jackson was much more the popular hero. He was much more charismatic, much more colorful. He had all of these things going for him that I think Polk did not.
Jackson as president has serious baggage. He's remembered as a champion of the common man, but his fiscal policies contributed to that credit crisis that sank Van Buren's career, along with half the banks in the whole country. Worse still, he was the driving force behind the Indian Removal Act, that infamous forced migration that killed thousands of Cherokee and came to be known as the Trail of Tears. Yet who does Barack Obama invoke in a campaign speech?
We will have to remember who we are as Democrats, that we are the party of Jefferson and Jackson.
Why does Jackson endure as a hero, the face of the Democrats, despite his serious failings? Or perhaps a better question is, was there something about Polk and his legacy? There's a big clue in a copy of the Memoirs of Ulysses Grant. Before he made his name in the Civil War, he was a young officer in the Mexican-American War. He writes, "The Southern Rebellion was largely the outgrowth of the Mexican War. Nations, like individuals, are punished for their transgressions. We got our punishment." Wow. And this conflict was the key event of Polk's presidency. For such a short war, it sure was a convoluted mess. After the acquisition, American settlers moved into the region, some taking root in what would become Texas. There was a small problem, however. That land wasn't part of the sale. The Mexican government allowed the settlers to stay, but they had to give up their slaves. The Americans chose to fight. Fast forward 10 years, when Polk fulfilled his promise to annex the now independent Republic of Texas. Except there was the small matter of the Texan border. Polk contended it was the Rio Grande del Norte. The Mexican government said it was further north, along the Nueces. Who was right? Polk did have that treaty signed by General Santa Anna, the one that created the Republic of Texas. It clearly set the border at the Del Norte. But the Mexicans said it was illegitimate, claiming Santa Anna had been forced to sign it. At this point, you might ask, why all the fuss over a matter of a few dozen miles, between which was a lot of sparsely populated, inhospitable terrain? It becomes clearer when you see where the two rivers go. The Nueces veers northward and forms a boundary with the Louisiana Territory. Now look where the Rio Grande goes. One river would effectively end the frontier somewhere along the Great Plains. The other could take the U.S. all the way to the coast.
The strategic decision of the U.S. had nothing to do with settling the limits of Texas. The goal, the ultimate goal, and the actual prize of the whole adventure was the acquisition of California.
Polk wanted it. To him, it was a matter of national security. To have a foreign power controlling the coast was a threat he felt he had to preempt. He tried to negotiate in the beginning, offering money to buy California and settle the border, but instability in Mexico's government stalled the talks. So Polk upped the ante. He sent troops into the disputed territory, to the northern shores of the Rio Grande, ostensibly to protect American property.
Clearly, the transport of troops into territory near the Rio Grande was a provocative move. I think he set in motion events that accepted war as the most objectionable of options, but nevertheless one we might have to take. I think you could say that about it.
It was like two kids riding on a school bus. One points his finger at the other, saying, "I'm not touching you, I'm not touching you, I'm not touching you." It was only a matter of time before the other threw a punch. And in April 1846, Mexico threw a punch. Polk had his casus belli, but he still had to contend with Congress, which constitutionally has the sole power to declare war. He circumvented their authority by arguing that war already existed. There was no need to declare it. Instead, he asked support in raising an army and supplying them. And since no one wanted to be accused of not supporting the troops, the opposition party, known as the Whigs, largely got on board. Still, a few voiced their doubts over the whole affair.
There was no need for this war. The causes were manufactured by the administration. They were to provoke an incident. Was there really an attack on Americans? You see what I mean? Was there really an attack on American soil? Was this really American soil? Was there really a crisis that we had to deal with? I don't think so. And isn't it Congress? Are we supposed to be presented with a war? Or are we in effect being presented with an ultimatum from Polk?
Abraham Lincoln, then an unknown congressman, stood up and called Polk a miserably perplexed man and challenged him to prove the spot where American blood was shed was indeed American territory. Polk never answered the challenge. In any case, the debate over the war's righteousness was soon rendered moot. Less than 2 years after it started, the Americans had captured Mexico City. The war was over. The loss was a humiliating one for Mexico. Their own fight for independence had been influenced by the American Revolution, and now to lose such land to them, it forever altered relations between the two powers. As for Polk, he got his border, and California, as well as everything in between. The so-called Mexican Cession would yield all or part of 6 new states. With time, he thought his critics would be silenced, proudly proclaiming that in 20 years the new land's value would be impossible to calculate. But he forgot to consider the cost.
Polk's presidency and the Mexican-American War set in motion political events that would lead to the Civil War.
It goes back to when Missouri joined the Union in 1821. To maintain the balance between North and South, slavery was contained to the area below Missouri's southern border. Well, except for Missouri. They could keep their slaves. That seemed to end the issue until Polk began his campaign of expansion, and people suddenly began to think about that old line, where it went, and what the implications were. Abolitionists argued it stopped at Texas, bottling up slavery in the Southeast. Slave owners said it kept going west, opening up the South all the way to the coast. And still others began to wonder if the line even applied anymore, or if each state had the right to choose for itself. And so the arguing began. The 1850s would be racked by crisis upon crisis, all stemming from the issue of slavery in the new territory. All told, it took scarcely a decade for everything to fall apart. And after the Civil War, the history that was written was one that laid the blame heavy upon Polk's shoulders. It was a history written by political adversaries, written by the victorious. And maybe they were right. Maybe Polk deserved it. That's what scared me. Had I really tried to resurrect the man who caused the American Civil War? Had I driven all that way, spent all that money, not to mention wasted my friend's time on a snipe hunt? At this point, I thought about cutting my losses and getting out right then and there. But I still had that letter, and I looked at it again. There are going to be conundrums and problems you are going to have to solve. Stay positive. Easier said than done. Fortunately, I had help. I had taken a break from editing one day when I got a package. It arrived priority post from Clifford Cranick, a historian who specialized in early photography. And what was inside was pretty cool. A new photograph of James Polk. As president, he set a number of firsts. The first to be photographed with his cabinet, the first to pose with his wife, the first to be captured in front of the White House. But beyond these bits of trivia, he was the first to embrace photography. Now for him, it was a matter of convenience. It was faster to stand for a photographer than a painter, which left more time for work. For the average American, it meant more. He was arguably the first president whose face was known to someone who had never seen him in person. And now, one more piece was restored. A second shot of him and his cabinet, taken just months before he left office. There they were. And there he was. Those piercing eyes were unmistakable. But something looked wrong. The photo's grainy, but he looked frail and haggard. The man was 53, but he looked far older. Power comes at a terrible price. You look at what the weight of the office did to Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, or to Franklin Roosevelt during World War II. But James Polk is different. Lincoln and FDR were thrust into crises. Polk more or less brought it upon himself. He didn't have to pursue war with Mexico. He didn't have to be so ambitious, so driven. Would a little less land have been so bad? So what happened to him, those 4 years in Washington, D.C.? Ah, Washington. For a history buff, this is Canterbury. A bit louder, though. Ah, that view. Nice room. Bathroom a bit small, perhaps. But it was good old Washington, warts and all. The last time I was there, the most memorable part was the weather. It was a model UN trip supposed to last a few days. But thanks to one of the worst snowstorms in their history, I wound up stuck in the hotel for most of it. I wasn't gonna get stuck this time.
This is Metro Center, your transferring point for the blue and orange line trains on the lower level. Doors will be opening on the right.
I began at the Capitol. It looked far different in Polk's day. The building was smaller, the rotunda made of wood. He spent 14 years here as a congressman, and 4 as House Speaker, where he gained a reputation as Old Hickory's inside man. His presence can be felt throughout these halls. There's quite a story in that room. In May 1844, Samuel Morse's first telegraph line was completed, linking Washington to Baltimore, where it just so happened that the Democratic National Convention was being held. Every moment, Van Buren's collapse, Polk's sudden rise, was being relayed back to the Capitol, where congressmen and senators alike gathered for the latest updates. They were witnessing the birth of live news media, though at the time no one grasped it. When Polk's nomination came across the wires, someone dug out a painting of his and hung it in a niche near the rotunda. During the general campaign, his opponents liked to ask, "Who is James K. Polk?" Somewhere down the line, the original emphasis was lost, compounding the legend that he was an unknown, a fluke, the first dark horse. It continues today. There is no statue for Polk, and that painting which hung here is long gone. There was a placard around here somewhere. Bingo. He spent a lot of late nights here in this room, at this very spot that marks where his desk was. There was that one note to his wife Sarah, where he mentioned working until 4 a.m. and having to return for a meeting at 11. That work ethic carried over to the White House. In 4 years, he was absent from D.C. only 30 days, most of it on just 2 trips. Only Sundays were off limits. Those days he went to church with Sarah at the First Presbyterian. That church is now a federal building. But he did go to this one, New York Presbyterian, while a congressman. As I wandered through this place where he had once prayed and worshipped, I noticed a pew that stood out, that was much older than the rest. Could it be? You'd think I'd learned by now. Statues and plaques aside, his touch is all over this city and the country. Take the postal system. Under Polk's administration, it was streamlined, including the introduction of a novel, though increasingly expensive little item, the postage stamp. The National Mall we know today was shaped by him. He chose the spot for the Smithson Castle, which was the first building of the Smithsonian Institute. He also picked the spot for the Washington Monument. He was even at the laying of the cornerstone on Independence Day, though when this print was made decades later, he was nowhere to be found. After the ceremony, it was back to business. As the city celebrated, he was still seeing visitors well into the night. And Polk's conduct during the Mexican War is worth scrutiny. In contrast to his image as a warmonger, his administration negotiated a peaceful settlement of the Oregon boundary. Some wanted more land, urging 54-40 or fight if the British resisted. Instead, Polk compromised on what is the modern-day boundary, avoiding a second, probably bloodier war. And after the guns fell silent in Mexico, he resisted the fanatics in his own party who called for taking the whole country, as part of a grand vision that included Cuba and Central America. Instead, he paid Mexico for the loss of California, leading some to cynically call it a war for negotiations. But there's two sides to everything. Polk's payment to Mexico rings pretty hollow, considering the causes of the war and how much the U.S. gained versus what it paid. It was a pittance. And who knows, maybe the reason he avoided war with the British was because the fight with Mexico made it impossible. A war on two fronts seldom works out well. Such contradiction. As I walked the National Mall, I wondered what place he deserved. And really, who gets remembered and honored? Is anyone entirely pure? Or are they all connected? Take Lincoln, for example. During the Civil War, Lincoln benefited mightily from the precedents Polk set as a war leader.
So you're gonna have to get a permit or go back out there, that area out there, and normally that's a stress, because any kind of professional looking equipment, you need a permit out here.
Okay, scratch that. What about Jefferson? Many of Polk's ideas came from him. Westward expansion, land acquisition.
So, what's this all about?
So many changes here, even in my lifetime. It used to be you could go up those steps. I still remember those protesters. I'd never seen anything like it back home. If you want to protest today, it's at a safe distance. And then, what does it really matter? When Polk was in office, it was so different. The White House wasn't some gated, sacred place you could only visit through your congressman. There were public receptions and concerts. Anyone and everyone came for cake and punch and a chance to shake hands with the commander-in-chief.
He kept open doors to the White House. In the morning, any American citizen could go and visit the president at the White House. Again, he saw himself as servant of the people.
Privately, though, Polk could have done without most of those visitors. They took time away from work. Most, he figured, were just out for jobs or political favors. I have great contempt for such persons, he wrote. He even talked of writing a book about it all, a tell-all about the true workings of government, of pay-to-play politics. It was a book he would never get to write. My last day in Washington, I went to see the notes Polk took for that tell-all book. Cameras are restricted outside of the reading rooms, but I forgot to turn mine off.
What's this number?
My registration card ID. Before I was given access, I had to register. It went smoothly, apart from a few points about my penmanship.
Does that say B4?
6-4.
Oh, okay. That was a B4. If I can't read it now, I don't think I'll be able to read it tomorrow.
There were 25 volumes in all, but I was limited to viewing 3. No edited text, no blurry microfilm. These were the originals, in his hand. This kind of access is rare. Only a handful of presidents kept diaries. And thanks to this new age of secrecy, it'll be decades before we get access to all of Clinton or Bush's papers. Polk's writing is there for all to see, like on that Wednesday in 1846. He writes, "At about 1 o'clock, a committee from Congress presented the act declaring war against Mexico. I read it in their presence, approved, and signed it. With that, war was on." He could claim Mexico fired the first shot, but the diary reveals how murky the situation really was. Even before he had received word of the Mexican attack, he was planning to declare war, a preemptive move. The Mexicans were damned no matter what. And he's so casual about it all. Did he realize the magnitude of what he was doing? Did he think of the consequences?
I do think it's fair to say that James K. Polk was a man of limited imagination. He had specific goals that he wanted, but he rarely asked himself big picture type questions.
He's certainly a product of the 19th century, and probably looked too much in the rearview mirror.
A hectic work schedule, micromanaging everything. He mentioned staying up until 6 a.m. proofreading a message to Congress. He took the role seriously, so much so that in the initial pages of his diary, he referred to himself in the third person, the president. This detached sensibility led to him being regarded as cold and aloof, with few close friends or intimate relationships. There was Jackson, of course, but he died just months after Polk entered office. Then there was his wife, Sarah. Their relationship is hard to pin down. Because she often accompanied him on his travels, there was little need to write letters. From what survives, it's clear he relied upon her. She helped with correspondence, relayed information, acted as his eyes and ears. When they were apart, he missed her. And she worried for him, told him to rest and, quote, not kill himself with fatigue. He and Sarah were childless, but they took in relatives, paid for school and clothes and travel. When someone he knew came for help, he gave it. There was that visit he described in his diary, where an old acquaintance came, asking for help. Polk noted how the man's hands trembled and gave him $100 in gold. Today that would be roughly $4,000. He called it a loan and took an IOU, but didn't expect to be paid back. In a subsequent entry, he mentions that the man had used the money to pay some debts, and then slit his throat. Fatalism and death was something that seemed to preoccupy James Polk. On his birthdays, his thoughts weren't happy, but solemn. On one he wrote, "I thought of the vanity of this world's honors, how little they would profit me half a century hence." It seemed that he sensed his mortality and acted as though he was running out of time, working faster, harder, pushing himself to the limits.
He was a workaholic. I mean, anyone who has studied Polk, I think, sees that he was absolutely obsessed with work. I think he was very task-oriented. Once he saw that something needed to be done, he could work himself to the point of physical exhaustion. I mean, you could in one sense say the man worked himself to death in White House. He worked himself to death.
And so I left Washington, D.C., and not long after, I was back on the road, headed to North Carolina. As luck would have it, I left in the midst of a gas shortage, so I stopped to fill up at a BP station in Knoxville. Oh wait, not that one. That one. $60 later, I was winding my way through the Appalachian Mountains, going back to where it all began. From the day he was born, James K. Polk prompted controversy and debate. His parents were both strong-willed and independent. They were both type A's, you could say, and therein lay the problem. Jane was a devout Presbyterian, while Sam, of whom no image survives, was a religious skeptic. I'd imagine their marriage had endured because they agreed to disagree, but when James was born November 2nd, 1795, he forced the issue. Jane wanted him baptized at their Presbyterian church, which no longer stands but would have looked not unlike the Polk's log house. However, her minister required Sam to take a vow of faith. Sam refused, and James went unanointed. To a lot of people, this might not seem like a very big deal. But Jane was particularly zealous in her religious convictions. She described a relative's alcoholism as divine providence and warned that the Lord can raise our comforts high or sink them to the grave as he pleases. Everything was a sign from God. And in addition to being ingrained with this fatalist sensibility, James Polk's early years were by all accounts marred by poor health. While his younger siblings helped their father on the farm, he, the firstborn, stayed inside, was cared for and doted on by his strict mother. He was too sick even to go to school. It was a miracle he even survived the trip from North Carolina to Tennessee. His story very nearly ended right then and there. In the fall of 1812, James's health turned critical, and out of desperation, his father Sam took him back east. He had hoped to reach Philadelphia, but the boy grew so sick that the pair soon found themselves in Kentucky at the front doorstep of Dr. Ephraim McDowell, who was a pioneer of surgery. His diagnosis? A bladder cyst. Without an operation, James would die. The procedure was done on McDowell's kitchen table. There was no antiseptic, no anesthesia to numb the pain. All they could do was ply him with brandy. Still, two men had to hold him down as the doctor began to cut. Somehow he survived. The surgery gave him a second lease on life, though the crude nature of the procedure rendered him sterile in the process. There is no guessing what the experience did to him emotionally, but the written accounts all agree that he was changed. He began attending school for the first time in his life. In 2 years, he was a student at Chapel Hill, and in 2 more, graduated valedictorian. Though he was so exhausted, it was 5 months before he was able to return to Columbia. The rest is history. All of these details, what did they add up to? James Polk, perhaps? For the first time, I felt like I knew him, could understand him. I think we all can to some extent. I, for one, had wanted to be a great runner like my dad, like those who won races and the admiration of their peers. I did the work, but always there were those who made it look so easy. What took all the effort I could muster, others could do without breaking a sweat. But I kept trying despite it all. Polk kept trying, despite his failings. Tried to transcend his limits to secure his own place in the annals of history.
Greatness is thrust upon you, and sometimes you seek it. And in his case, he was seeking it.
But there is a danger. Making this film, I've sacrificed time, money, a social life, simple pleasures for the chance to make something great that could stand on its own, free from the shadows cast by Ken Burns's work and 100 others. The goal threatens to take over your life. There is a line that I've flirted with, and one I think Polk crossed. And there was something in those photographs of him that I had missed before. Look at how he holds his arm. Here, and here, and here, and here. According to French etiquette, this was the pose of a man of good breeding, of high class and importance. It was as though Polk was trying to rise above his frontier origins, to remake himself, at least in his own mind. But who knows? All these things could be something, could be nothing. That's history's dirty little secret. It's all just someone's best guess, based on available evidence, which has often been manipulated. Lincoln's son burned a number of his father's letters after his assassination. George Washington's wife did the same after his passing. Polk has the diary, but for all he reveals in it, there is as much he keeps hidden. People are the greatest mysteries of all, and sometimes they want to keep it that way. But if I was right about how these details all added up, it's not like he would have been unusual. After all, what was Western expansion and manifest destiny, really, but a lot of people who wanted to carve out a new place for themselves, who rejected their lot in life? You had farmers and immigrants who saw the West as their ticket out and up. Abolitionists who flooded the territories to start free communities, and anti-abolitionists who followed to stop them. You had ranchers and drovers who could raise cattle on it. And for each one of these, a dozen more to establish toll roads, trading posts, settlements. You had railroaders who dreamt of a transcontinental rail line and all the people who worked for them. Before his rise to national prominence, Abraham Lincoln flourished as a railroad attorney. All manner of industries looked to exploit the West's natural resources, while merchants eyed the Pacific, salivated at the thought of trade with the East. Heck, even early environmentalists were in on it. They saw expansion as the way to check urbanization. And throughout it all, the media greased the wheels. It was Horace Greeley, a newspaperman, who said, "Go west, young man." The term manifest destiny was coined by a newspaper columnist. Painters gloried in the landscape, and writers romanticized it. It was a movement, a dream that was so important that it tragically became the ends for which the means were justified. War, slavery, subjugation of entire peoples. It was a wave Polk didn't start so much as rode to its crest before it crashed against the rocks. To quote F.J. Turner, "And so the disintegrating forces of civilization entered the wilderness." But we hate to see ourselves in those terms. The United States was founded upon certain ideals: equality, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they remain good ideals, despite our tendency to apply them selectively. And to preserve the legacy we created, we bury the Polks and sanitize the story. In the National Archives, you'll find nothing for Polk's acquisitions on display, but the Louisiana Purchase has a place of honor. But is it any more clean-cut than the Mexican Cession?
It's easy to love the Louisiana Purchase because all it involved was an exchange of cash. The battle for the Louisiana Purchase really took place at the Little Bighorn and at the massacre at Wounded Knee. And our discomfort comes because we understand the horrible human costs of those acquisitions, and yet I haven't heard anybody say, let's bring back the buffalo, or give New Mexico back to the Mexicans.
It was hypocritical in the 19th century, it's certainly hypocritical now, to argue that all these things were misdeeds and bad things, and yet we held on to them.
It's easy to condemn Polk for what he did, but who would return the land and its riches? Not to mention that certain discovery that came in a locked box to Polk's Treasury Secretary just a few months before he left office. It had come several thousand miles from a place called Sutter's Mill. Polk announced the discovery in his final State of the Union and touched off the gold rush. It was gold that would back the Union as the Confederates resorted to printing paper money. Gold to fund that transcontinental railroad and fuel industrialization. That first shipment was melted down, turned into commemorative coins with CAL proudly stamped on them.
And you can imagine the bitterness felt in Mexico City and elsewhere. You know, those kinds of riches now in the hands of the United States with those areas. So we're not just talking about the northern provinces of Mexico and large areas of desert. Now it's suddenly seen that Mexico's loss was, doubly severe.
I recall a few lines from Thomas Hood. Gold, bright and yellow, hard and cold, molten, graven, hammered and rolled, heavy to get, light to hold, good or bad 1,000-fold. After all this to-do about gold and land and wars of conquest, I can't help thinking back to that election in 1844, how close it was, how different it could have been. You had on the one side James Polk, and on the other Henry Clay of the Whigs, who wanted to wait on Texas and westward expansion, instead focus on developing what we had to build infrastructure and industry. The country was predictably divided. Polk did well in the frontier and slave states, who had the most to gain by moving west. Clay held his own in the more industrialized regions like New England, as well as the landlocked states. But in the end, only one would decide the winner. Florida hadn't been annexed yet, so we can't blame them for this. No, it all came down to New York, and when the popular vote was tallied, Polk won by little more than 5,000 ballots. But a third-party candidate picked up more than 15,000 votes, votes that would have probably gone to Clay. But instead, New York and the country voted yes for Polk, yes for Texas, yes for expansion, gave him the political capital to do what he did. Maybe if the Whigs hadn't used those dirty tactics that backfired and generated sympathy for their opponent, spread rumors about Polk's plantation of slaves branded with his initials. Slavery. The elephant in the room. If I haven't mentioned Polk owned slaves, it's because he himself tried to keep this detail hidden. It was something he kept far from Washington and Tennessee. It was something that took me deep into the South, to the cotton belt of Mississippi. This is the Polk plantation today. It still produces cotton, though what once took months to gather by hand is now done in a day, a single afternoon. And whereas before slaves had labored into the winter to gather every last scrap, now it's no longer cost efficient. It was in the Polk family for decades, first run by James, then Sarah, who sold it and the slaves for a profit a year before the war. It traded hands a number of times since then, fell into neglect and obscurity, until the Sides family bought it.
Well, my father was a farmer, and he bought it shortly before I was born. And they began to clear it up. Of course, you can see now that this part here is grown up, but they began to clear it up and turn it into a good cotton farm. I believe it's had cotton here ever since the president had it.
It was good land, better than what Polk had in Tennessee, and as he prospered in the 1830s and 40s, he bought more and more slaves to work it, always in small numbers, and always in secret, with a third party acting on his behalf. The man himself only visited the property occasionally, relied instead on overseers to drive the laborers. Overseers who ranged from competent to sadistic. One punished a slave by whipping him and throwing salt on the wounds between lashings. The brutal ones didn't last long, were often replaced, leading some to believe he was a good master who cared for his slaves. He did allow them to grow cotton in their spare time, for which he paid them in cash. And there were those who were quite loyal to him. But all this reveals is a huge problem in the record. All these accounts are from his point of view, and the slaves were largely illiterate or didn't pass their stories down to their children.
See, that's the thing that bothers me. That's the thing that really bothers me. I don't know if he just didn't care to share it. When I asked my brothers, they never heard our father say anything about our great-grandfather, being a slave. Or he just didn't care about sharing it, or maybe he didn't even know.
It's between the lines that the story grows far more sinister. Those cotton crops he let them grow, he paid them the going rate, but on at least one occasion resold the crops when the price went up and pocketed the difference. And then there was that spot that Don and I had to hike to, deep in the woods of the Polk plantation.
When we get in here, this is basically the cemetery here. And you'll see depressions everywhere. And every one of them is a grave. There's the footstone and the headstone, and it's nothing but a triangular piece of rock. But that's either one of the slaves' graves or one of their children. But these graves are just scattered all through here. I don't know how many there are. I don't know. I'm guessing 50 people are buried here, 100. Some slaves and their descendants, first and second generation, just got these just simple fieldstone markers.
150 years since slavery was abolished, and it still doesn't make any sense. Why did Polk participate in such an institution?
You almost have to surmise, you know, that it was said that he wanted to experiment with slavery to see what the merits and the pros and the cons were. You know, but whether that's true or not, I don't know. It seems to me that at that time that land was the thing, and that if there was a fortune to be made, it was to be made in land.
He believed in slavery, white supremacy, the dignity and value of the individual landowning white male American.
The Pope didn't see or didn't fully understand how slavery would become such a huge issue, that Polk would just say, well, states' rights, it's up to the state, we'll do whatever they want. And these historians don't see Polk necessarily as intentionally trying to expand slavery, but they just see him as lacking the vision to realize what a huge issue that this would become.
Again, that fatal lack of vision and foresight. That he tried to keep it secret is most disturbing. Why, if you genuinely believed something was legal and right, would you try to hide it? And all the while, he still went to church every Sunday.
It is quite contradictory. But when it comes to religion, I believe that contradictions are not unusual.
I started by having a curious admiration for Polk's achievements, then disdain at what he did to accomplish them, then some understanding for his motives. But now, I asked Ora Lee what she thought of this man who once owned her ancestors.
He was a great man. I have a lot of respect for him, I really do.
I was taken aback. I was afraid that, with me being white, that she was telling me what she thought I wanted to hear. So I asked her again.
Our family has high respects, high regards for him as president, and it just so, we feel honored that he did have a plantation here in Yalobusha County, and even more honored to know that our great-great-grandfather was on that plantation. So when he left us with some history there to cherish for the rest of our lives.
Here was a woman who had grown up in the segregated South, who had every reason to be angry. Yet she felt pride. She was proud that her ancestor, slave though he may have been, had this historic connection, had helped to build a country. Her family had a story when so many others don't. I had never thought of it in this way. It put things in a different perspective, and suddenly my own feelings seemed kind of petty.
It's there, you know, it happened. This is actually the way it was. You know, this is history. And every which way you turn, it was there. So, you know, let's move on and look forward and try to make it a better place.
Yes, we can. America, we have come so far. We have seen so much, but there's so much more to do. What progress will we have made? This is our chance to answer that call.
As I rode that empty train back to Carbondale, I thought of Polk's last months in office and the similar journey he took. As his tenure came to a close, he tried to tie up loose ends, like giving gold swords to several generals back from the war. One turned up on the Antiques Roadshow not too long ago.
If I had this in my gallery, it's something that would reasonably be in the $200,000 range. It's such an important piece of American history.
At one cabinet meeting, they discussed a proposed road across the Isthmus of Panama. Polk vetoed the idea. The government, he said, had no constitutional authority to engage in such a project. He took occasional breaks, like the day he posed for that photo with his cabinet, as well as this one by himself. The photographer later touched it up to make him look more youthful, a bit healthier. But those breaks were exceptions. On Christmas Day, 1848, he stayed at home, leaving only for church service. He noted that he saw not a single visitor, and that the day was damp and gloomy. Then it was back to work. As his tenure closed, he worried more and more about the rising tensions over slavery in the new territory. But there was little he could do now. His last day in office, he was up until 4 a.m. finishing last-minute paperwork. He went to bed for 2 hours, then woke up to do some more. He left office March 4th, handing power to General Zachary Taylor, who had run for the Whigs on his war record. Polk quickly and quietly left Washington that night to begin a long farewell tour of the South. And everywhere he stopped, politicians greeted him, asked him for a speech or to stay for dinner. His retirement had barely begun, yet he again fell into the routine of long days and late nights, going to an endless cavalcade of parades, ceremonies, and luxurious dinners. But as he neared New Orleans, he began to hear ominous rumors of an epidemic. It was cholera, which slowly kills through dehydration and multiple organ failure. It was spread by contaminated water, but such theories of antisepsis were decades off. He began to avoid people, shun guests. And yet, the disease stalked him. As he sailed up the Mississippi River, other passengers began to sicken. March 23, 1849. A man died on board the boat of cholera today. His body was put in a coarse, rough box, hastily nailed together, and was entrusted to some wood choppers at a wood yard for burial. The boat then proceeded upriver. After 4 weeks of trains, boats, and stagecoaches, he arrived in Nashville. But the relief was short-lived. He had bought a mansion here, that one I had searched for in vain. But the renovations were incomplete. Always the man to take charge, he went to work. Through the spring, he focused on assembling his large library. That's what he was doing on June 2nd. He wrote, "I remained the balance of the day at my house, and was engaged in arranging my library of books in presses which I had caused to be made to hold them." It was cholera. Polk lingered for 13 days. As he lay dying, he was visited by a Methodist pastor he knew, who finally baptized him, despite his mother's protests that he be anointed by a Presbyterian. Some suggested it was the last act of a man with a guilty conscience. Others said he was keeping a promise to the pastor. He died on June 15th, barely 3 months after leaving office. His last words were reportedly of his love for Sarah. The service was held the next day at McKendree Methodist Church, after which he was quickly buried. The country went through the customary mourning, though opinions of him were mixed. James Buchanan, his former Secretary of State, said of his presidency that it will be one of the most brilliant and useful in our annals. William Lloyd Garrison, the famed abolitionist, was less kind, saying, "He probably died an unrepentant man-stealer. His administration has been a curse to the country." In the ensuing years of crisis and war, few cared anymore. His legacy was left to the historians to debate.
He was not a person who could galvanize the country. He never made a speech to the nation that would have been, you know, on all the channels of TV at the same time and so forth. It just wasn't in his nature and makeup to be that kind of leader. But he was an incredible leader. I consider him one of the great presidents. And I think he's had a bad press, but that seems to be improving, so we may move on up in that top 10.
The lesson of the Mexican War is that imperialism doesn't pay. I mean, someone could take that approach, for example. The lesson of Polk is that you know, he was a slave-holding president, and this was really a naked push to expand one of the most despicable institutions the United States ever endorsed, slavery. You see what I mean? It was about the expansion of slavery. Polk was a slave-holding president. That's what this war was about, and that's why we should roundly condemn it. So, in a sense, it's dealer's choice.
And so the long journey had ended. The train was going back to Chicago, but I was home.
Mrs. Obama at that dance at the Commander-in-Chief's ball. Let's go to Megyn Kelly with a guest. Megyn?
There was still the matter of my ending. Ken Burns' letter didn't have any advice on that. I tried to take my mind off of things for a while, but it didn't help much.
Thanks for coming back. All right, the name of this book is American Lion. Andrew Jackson.
What happened next? You may choose to believe or not, but it happened all the same. I found my answer in that film that started it all for me, the Civil War. I was watching the last episode again, for ideas, for something. And suddenly, there it was. All these years, and I'd never noticed it until now. Polk's tomb. If there is such a thing as fate, this was it. I had my ending. Ladies and gentlemen, James Knox Polk, 11th President of the United States. He's buried with Sarah next to him. Their tomb sits on the grounds of the Nashville State Capitol building, amidst memorials to other notable Tennesseans. Andrew Jackson has the place of honor. Poor James, always in his shadow. What can I say about him that hasn't been said already? He's a man who defies easy answers and short summations. You could argue forever whether what he did was good or bad. It doesn't change that he did it. But he's a part of the story, and to forget him is to forget it happened. And if we don't know where we've come from, how do we know where to go to next? These past few months on the road learning about James Polk have been some of the hardest, most stressing of my life. they've also been the most rewarding. I've been east and south, north and west, seen some amazing things, and met a lot of fascinating, passionate people I'll remember the rest of my life. And by studying James K. Polk, I've learned a lot about myself. I think we all can learn from him by embracing the good aspects of his character, his drive, his ambition, while avoiding his mistakes by being humble and not missing the forest for the trees. That's the great thing about studying the people of history. If you really let their stories in, you can't help but come away a better person. I have. And for that reason, I'll never forget James Polk. And that's the story. Now, if you'll excuse me, I think I'll go for a run.
In 1844, the Democrats were split. The three nominees for the presidential candidate were Martin Van Buren, a former president and an abolitionist, James Buchanan, a moderate, Lewis Cass, a general and expansionist. Years he met his every goal. He seized the whole Southwest from Mexico, made sure the tariffs fell, and made the English sell the Oregon